The Rings of Power is back for its second season, and I can't say I'm expecting much, especially when we have the same writers and same showrunners building off the already crumbled foundation of their first season. So rather than waste any time with why I think we're in for a painful 8 hours, we'll just pick up where we left off and get straight into the first episode itself. Season 2 starts us off with Sauron's backstory, something that now I've seen I wish I hadn't seen, but here we are. We find Sauron in Forodwaith Castle giving a speech to Adar and the Orcs shortly after Morgoth's defeat. Because Sauron, you see, wants to be their new leader, and the Orcs now for some reason have the power to vote, but first they need to be convinced.
For I seek a new kind of power. Power of the unseen world.
And this is a power they'll use to enslave the people of Middle-earth. So we're pretty much just being reminded of what Sauron's motivations are. But this seems to work wonders on the Orcs, that is until Sauron sabotages himself. Someone who's supposed to be highly intelligent and manipulative, but hasn't realised he's being written by functional window lickers, destroys any chance he has at being Morgoth's successor.
Many orcs will die.
So that's strike one apparently. The Orcs don't realise they're a fucking army for some reason, and so this is some kind of shock to them. Sauron goes on to say that although many of them will die, out of the chaos they'll forge a new and perfect order. They'll no longer be hunted, but instead worshipped as the saviours of Middle-earth.
Doubt me at your peril.
And that's when Sauron goes completely off the rails. He doesn't try to convince them or manipulate them into doing what he wants when we know that he can. He can even enter their minds. Instead, well, he takes this option.
Men will never look upon you with anything but horror and disgust.
So Sauron is a fucking moron. Why am I not surprised? He fails to do even the simplest of things, like read a fucking room. And surely he's well aware of Adar's love for the Orcs to the point of calling them his children. But no, he seems to be oblivious to read any of the signs, even when an Orc who must have forgot this was literally fucking Sauron tries to attack him from behind. Is Sauron just really desperate to sabotage himself? No, he's just a retard. Not only has he insulted the Orcs, he's now killed one of them brutally with a grin on his face, leaving the Orcs and Adar audibly and visibly pissed off. And still, Sauron doesn't seem to sense that maybe he should change his approach. He instead decides to trust Adar enough to crown him with an obvious potential fucking weapon. Sauron seemed to have forgot about his awesome reflexes that we seen just moments ago. He must have missed that very loud and obvious sound effect. The Orcs then take turns in stabbing Sauron. His force abilities are mostly useless, so he's eventually beaten. The great, intelligent and powerful Sauron has been defeated by some random fucking Orcs.
What?
Clearly the writers don't want me to see Sauron as a serious threat, because why else would they reduce him to being this dumb? He insulted the Orcs, killed one of them and trusted Adar, when he should know how much Adar loves them, and now finds himself dead. This wasn't some grand downfall of Sauron like I know the writers intended, it's a complete clown show. Adar commands them to stop and kick Sauron to see if he's truly dead, when Adar should know who and what Sauron is. He's a magical being, so he wouldn't be easy to kill. And that apparently is how this place became an icy hellscape so evil that fire could never give off heat.
Evil!
So now we know the circumstances of Sauron's death at the hands of Adar and his so-called children, at the cost of making Sauron retarded in order for it to work, which isn't in any way believable. We then follow Sauron's blood dripping down into the depths of the mountain, seeing the years pass until, because we're just so lucky, we get to see how Sauron regenerates. He turns into... is that a fucking spaghetti monster? If your reaction was to burst out laughing like I'm sure every viewer would have, I don't think that was their intention. Literally anything would have been better than what some fuckwit at Amazon came up with. Rather than come up with something a little more magical, they went with spaghetti monster Sauron crawling out the side of a mountain, going down it like a slip and slide, to then crawl across a valley and then dramatically fall off a rock. A rock, by the way, he could have just went around. Where exactly is he or it even going? Is the plan just to drag himself for eternity? The answer to that is no. He's luckily landed on a road at exactly the right moment to get ran over and stuck on the wheel of a passing by car. Why anybody would be out here in this barren wasteland remains to be seen. But this allows him to, I guess, steal this peasant's life juice and rematerialise to be reborn in the form of Halbrand. So that's how that works. I don't think we needed to see that. Also, next time, I guess Adar should just make sure he's got a jar handy. We then see Sauron walk day and night to where exactly we don't know, until he luckily crosses paths with a group of people that have recently survived an attack from orcs. Something which one of the men warns him about and then goes on to offer up life lessons to Sauron, as one does when they're escaping death. Sauron notices the sigil that he had in Season 1 that before was owned by this random peasant. I really don't know why Sauron has any interest in this at all, but as we know, it's very important for the events of Season 1. It also makes Galadriel look even dumber than she already was, because the sigil is something just anyone could have. But she goes on to force the idea on Sauron that he's the king of the Southlands, who then asks what it is and why the man wears it, to be told that it's a symbol of kings long dead. Kings that this peasant's family served, and he wears it as a reminder that their fates are never certain, that fortunes can turn for even the most powerful.
A sure path may crumble, but there's always another.
And this is what makes Sauron consider another path to someplace better, someplace good. He's then offered to join this group of peasants to a place across the sea. Where exactly, we don't know. We just know they think there's land there. That's it. So maybe there might be some land. So Sauron decides to take him up on his offer, because we all know where this has to go. So we find Sauron sailing across the sea and contemplates changing his ways and becoming someone good, although he doesn't know how. After telling the peasant he's done evil, he's then told even if he has, he can seek forgiveness by changing his nature with one good deed after another. Something he considers for a split second and quickly decides against it after they're attacked by the giant worm, where he leaves the old man for dead and steals his sigil. My assumption is that the sigil can be a reminder of fortunes changing like the long dead kings for Sauron himself, who then comes face to face with the giant worm which is about to eat him. It's not very clear, but I assume Sauron mind-controlled the sea creature from not killing him, which then leads me to assume in Season 1 he controlled this to attack him and Galadriel for no other reason than to save her, which he does later on anyway, so it doesn't really benefit him. And that takes us to Sauron and Galadriel's meeting. So this is confirmation that Sauron knew nothing of where Galadriel was. It literally is, he bumped into her in the middle of the fucking ocean. And with all the context behind Sauron's journey here, just makes what was already contrived nonsense even worse. Spaghetti Sauron had to rise, crawl off, and land on the road at exactly the right moment, picked up by a cartwheel in the barren wasteland to rematerialise. He then had to bump into this specific peasant that he would never have met if he arrived 10 seconds later, and to then be offered passage on a ship that he decides to take for very paper-thin reasons, considers being good for a split second, then doesn't, and just as he's decided to be evil again, Galadriel shows up, which eventually gives him the opportunity to help craft the 3 elven rings. Put simply, we have a clown car full of contrived bullshit. We then cut to Lindon, where we find Galadriel chasing Elrond for possession of the 3 rings. So at some point in Eregion, where we last left them, Elrond snatched up the rings to take them to Gil-galad, and Galadriel chased him all the way there, day and night, when you consider how far away Lindon is. Elrond eventually outmaneuvers Galadriel, and she's stopped by elven guards and brought before Gil-galad, who Elrond has told about Halbrand and Galadriel not telling them who he really is. Gil-galad tells her that Elrond has informed him of Halbrand not being who he claimed and her withholding that information.
Who is he?
He is not what I thought, which is the reason I did what I did.
Yeah, that's not a response to what Gil-galad just said. He asked why you withheld the information, and you said because he wasn't who I thought he was. So Galadriel was just embarrassed that she was tricked. That's all that response is. Really, you would never endanger the elves? That I find strange when that is exactly what you did. You found out literal Sauron played a part in creating these rings and said nothing. Which, by the way, she has still said fucking nothing. Then finally, when forced to by Gil-galad about who Halbrand is...
Yes, Sauron.
I don't know why she's so reluctant to just say who it is when it's in her best interest to do so. Her entire motivation is based on taking revenge against Sauron, who killed her brother. From the start of season 1, she consistently asked Gil-galad to give her an army, and now when she has all the pieces in place and the proof that Sauron has returned, she isn't interested anymore. She's more worried about what the elves think of her, when what we've come to know about her is that she doesn't care about anything but her revenge. So what should be happening in the scene from the very start is Galadriel instantly telling Gil-galad Sauron is in fact alive and demanding an army to stop him. But instead, they found a way to assassinate her by forgetting the single motivation she had. Gil-galad asks Elrond for the rings, who is against using them because they don't yet know the depths of Sauron's influence. This is something that is barely considered by anyone else except Elrond. Galadriel, on the other hand, wants to use the rings because she believes Sauron never touched them, never considering for a moment that maybe he doesn't have to physically touch them, he just needs the elves to have them for whatever reason that could be. Gil-galad reminds them, or rather us, that soon the elves will have to abandon these shores, so comes to the viewpoint that if they leave now with Sauron back, the people of Middle-earth will be left under Sauron's tyranny. Elrond, who seems to have eaten his Weetabix today, says that simply using the rings could be how Sauron attains his full power, so they should destroy them. Or maybe there could be a way to find out, but I'm gonna press X to doubt on them actually testing the rings. So this brings them quite the conundrum. If you use the rings, you...
No!
Never mind, he's jumped, which is the first step to a plan. It's also something that Gil-galad could have stopped if he told the guards to seize Elrond earlier, rather than wait until he took a dive. We then cut away to Mordor, which is the last place we left Sauron in Season 1, who's found himself rounded up by orcs who still believe him to be the king of the Southlands. Adar and the orcs have enslaved the peasants, who should have all died in a pyroclastic flow, and Old Man Waldreg demands their allegiance or be put to death. Sauron is brought before Adar, claiming he wants to negotiate.
Let my people go.
Pressed so hard they could not stand. Let my people go.
Let my people go, or yours will die.
Adar tells him they've defeated everyone and have no one left to fear. Sauron tells him that there's one they should fear, someone that Galadriel has allied herself with.
She sought out a new ally, an ancient sorcerer.
The implication is that Galadriel has allied herself with Sauron, but why would Adar have any reason to believe this when he knows Galadriel was hunting Sauron to kill him? And at the moment, Adar doesn't believe him, although him and his children are worried about the idea of Sauron returning, which is something Adar shouldn't think to be impossible. Sauron tells him if he lets his people go, he'll tell him everything and where to find Sauron so Adar can destroy him. He of course demands to know everything or he'll kill him.
If I die, all that I know dies with me.
Did Sauron actually think the trope of "you can't kill me" would work when it's obvious Adar can just torture you for the information? Although I don't know if he would have to when this is the story he's expected to believe. He thinks, for some reason, Sauron is dead and impossible for him to return. He knows Galadriel wouldn't work with Sauron, at least willingly, so Adar has no reason to keep Sauron alive. But of course he does, and throws him into a cell. So whatever Sauron's plan is, I guess we'll find out later. Which takes us over to the not Gandalf and Nori plotline on their way to Rune, still hoping to find the stars from Season 1. Not Gandalf approaches what looks like a staff that, as he goes to touch, is given a collection of memories or things to come. We then snap back to reality, where we learn these are the dreams that he's been having. Part of me really hopes that this plotline isn't just to get a fucking staff, but I wouldn't be surprised. We're told by Nori that not Gandalf has been having recurring dreams. Dreams, she says, maybe is a clue to what they're going to find on their journey. It's a fucking staff, isn't it? They soon realise they've got themselves lost, and as Nori points out, are running low on snails, so tries to convince him to do the trick he did back in the grove. Not Gandalf is reluctant to do so because of what happened last time, forgetting the fact that it was Nori, her parents, and dumb as fuck sister's fault. He eventually gives in and destroys the tree, releasing a nest of termites which Nori is happy about because of course she is, but this is not what he intended. We then cut away to them by the fire where not Gandalf is upset he lost control.
So you need to learn how not to lose control.
Fucking stellar advice. Why is she here again? Alright, terrible parents, and we need to have a hobbit and a wizard go on an adventure just like before. Not Gandalf goes on to speak of his dream, saying in the dream there's a branch that when he reaches out to grasp, and then he cuts himself off. Saying some things are best shared not out loud, meaning we can't give away the mystery yet. So Nori tries to cheer him up.
I can feel the legs and the throat.
That's the best part.
You disgust me.
She goes on to talk about Poppy to show that she's homesick, which not Gandalf assures her is normal, saying he misses his home as well. Which, as Nori reminds him, he doesn't remember.
Sometimes I perceive a glimmer of it, longing, feeling I can't remember, or even name.
So they're both homesick, that's all we've really established. Not Gandalf then notices a fire in the distance and concludes that they're being followed by who or what we don't know. It can't be anyone that bad because why else would they light a fire to alert you that you're being followed? But I guess we'll find out later. We cut back to Sauron in his cell with a warg in his face until Waldreg brings him food and asks about Sauron. And with no response, Waldreg decides to beat him. Sauron says that when he's released by Adar, he's going to kill him, who Waldreg claims doesn't even remember he's here, but he is in fact listening, which makes this next part pretty hard to not hear. How could Adar not hear that? He was clearly close by and could hear what was going on. But of course, if he heard that part, Sauron couldn't go to wherever the plot will take him next. As for us, we're off to the Grey Havens of Lindon, where we get a glimpse of Elrond hiding under a bridge. Obviously, he's perfectly fine, and his plan is to not try and escape with the rings to ensure the elves don't use them, but instead to hide and wait it out. I would think there'd be a lot more conviction considering you jump from a fucking waterfall to prevent it. We're then introduced to Cirdan, who seems to be training elves in carpentry, piecing together boats.
Perfection.
Perfection exists only in Valinor.
Oh, this fucking shit. What's the point?
So I guess this is meant to be the wise elf, only he doesn't seem very wise with a response like that, but okay. He comes back to the boathouse later to find Elrond, who claims he had nowhere else to turn.
You are the oldest and wisest of our kind.
Why is it that people in this show talk to each other like they've never met before? There's never any attempt to be subtle. They have to shout out, "You are the oldest, you are the wisest elf," rather than allowing the audience to gather, "Oh, this must be someone Elrond trusts and respects if he's the first person he came to." But no, we don't seem to get any of that. Cirdan then says he perceives Elrond to carry something and asks what it is, and that's all we get for now. Which takes us back to Gil-galad, who's written a letter to be delivered directly to Celebrimbor to inform him that Halbrand is in fact Sauron. It's really baffling that you waited an entire day to do this when you know how important it is that Celebrimbor is aware of that. So you should have sent someone as soon as you found out about Sauron. You would think Gil-galad, who also wants to stop Sauron, would understand that. Galadriel thanks Gil-galad for siding with her and using the rings, which isn't how he sees it.
Because of you, our enemy lives.
What exactly is the reason they keep saying this? I don't think there's any instance of Galadriel saving Sauron, but even Sauron said it in Season 1, when all that happened was he just used her. If anything, she should be accused of being retarded. Gil-galad says that because of her, they have no choice but to test the virtue of the rings. Well, technically you do have a choice. You could destroy them, but that hasn't even been considered or discussed. The most we've got is they should be destroyed, and the other side saying, no, they shouldn't. when you could make it a little more interesting and actually think about it for more than 2 seconds.
I should have you thrown in fetters and cast to the Ettenmoors for what you've done.
Then why have you not?
I am considering it.
Of course, she wouldn't get thrown in jail. Galadriel, as of this moment, has never faced any real consequences from Gil-galad. In the first episode of Season 1, she disobeys Gil-galad by hunting for Sauron longer than she was ordered to, and rather than face punishment, she was allowed to return to Valinor. And then she gave Sauron what he wanted like the idiot she is, and when she found out about Sauron and said nothing, there's no consequence. Which could change, it just hasn't yet.
I swear to you, High King, I will not stop until he is destroyed, and I have put this right.
Oh, so she does remember a motivation then, although now it's treated as though that wasn't always the case. Gil-galad is then informed that there's no sign of Elrond at the bottom of the waterfall. They theorise that he could have drowned, which Galadriel doesn't believe. So Gil-galad orders a watch at every crossing to prevent him from escaping, which is a good idea. So then why the fuck didn't you do that already when the obvious thing for Elrond to do is to escape? And then finally, because the plot is ready to move again, Galadriel was convinced he wasn't intending to escape because he spoke of destroying the rings. So comes to the conclusion he would go to someone old and wise whose voice could turn the tide and command respect of even Gil-galad. The idea being that he could have an effect on the other elves in stopping them from using the rings. My question is still, how did it take you this long to figure out? They treat Galadriel as though she's a genius for this idea when it's so obvious. If Gil-galad had put out watches on the roads earlier than he did, he would know Elrond didn't escape. So the obvious next step, or what you would do at the same time, would be to think of who he would go to and start knocking on doors. That's how simple it is to find him, but they did everything backwards. Gil-galad is supposed to be this wise king, and his instant reaction when Elrond jumped wasn't to instantly order the elves to search the water, put guards on every road in and out of Lindon, and knock on people's doors, especially those who Elrond associates with. That's what you would do when you know how important the rings are to you, but instead we've got this incompetent twat. We then cut back to Elrond and Cirdan.
You may examine them.
I have seen Celebrimbor's work before.
You have not seen what I have seen.
I have seen Celebrimbor's work before.
You have not seen what I have seen.
Why wouldn't he want to see them, especially if he's about to provide Elrond with insight and advice on what to do next? Just because you've seen Celebrimbor's work is not an excuse to not see them now. They're something completely different. They're also something that could mean the elves don't have to leave Middle-earth. I would say it's very important that you get the full picture. He then mentions that Celebrimbor always used to talk of crafting objects of such power they could change the hearts of anyone who would behold them. And if they have in fact turned elf against elf, well then he succeeded.
If what you told me is true, these 3 rings were made without Sauron's touch.
I feel like Elrond is the only one that can fathom the idea that Sauron doesn't have to physically have a touch in the crafting of the rings, even though he literally does touch the mithril in Celebrimbor's workshop. Elrond tells him the rings need to be destroyed because they could still be a ploy from Sauron, to which Cirdan reminds him that doing so would mean abandoning Middle-earth and asks if he could accept that. Elrond says that if to do otherwise means falling prey to the designs of the enemy, he could accept that. This scene really isn't adding anything so far except repeating information. We know where Elrond stands, we know what destroying the rings will mean. I thought this guy was supposed to be their wisest elf. Cirdan finally gets to the fucking point and offers a way of destroying them, and it's as simple as, we'll take them out to the edge of the bay and throw them into a deep scar on the seabed. That's apparently how easy it would be. Just go out a mile from where they currently are now and throw them into the sea. That sounds a lot easier than, say, journeying all the way to Mordor and casting the rings into Mount Doom. I guess they could have just thrown them into the Bay of the Grey Havens. It's already obvious Cirdan's plan isn't going to work, so then why would he even suggest it? When he knows the power of these rings, he should know it wouldn't be as easy as that, especially if he's supposed to be this wise elven elder. The other thing the writers haven't bothered to do is actually flesh out Cirdan as a character, so we don't know why, whether he agrees to destroy the rings or not. He doesn't seem to have any thoughts on the matter like any other person would. Cirdan is then cut off when they hear that Galadriel and Gil-galad have arrived. Galadriel was granted permission to reason with Elrond before the Elven guards arrest him, and Gil-galad allows it because he definitely won't try to run away again, even though he previously jumped from a waterfall to do so. She goes to talk with Elrond, telling him she's come to coax him out, and if he doesn't come of his own accord, he'll be forced. As if that's a choice. She asks him to help her succeed in this after all her recent failures. She says that with 3 rings there's balance, as if that made any sense in the first place. What if all 3 ring bearers are corrupted, or 2 against 1? There's not much of a balance with a possible corruption component. She then says they both chose this path together, which Elrond calls her out on, saying she chose it for him. Which is true when she gave him no alternative when she chose to withhold Halbrand's true identity. Elrond asks why the idea of the rings corrupting them frightens her so much.
Because in my heart, I know the 3 rings are free of his influence.
Yeah, that's not exactly hard evidence, and again we are witnessing no one in disagreement with Elrond process the idea they could be corrupted by the rings. He then asks her if she's free of Sauron's influence, and that if she refused to return to Valinor, was it to fight darkness or darkness calling to her? And he does have a point. If only he knew her threat of genocide and torture of Adar, that was pretty villainous.
I did what I felt was right. And time alone will reveal whether that was folly or wisdom.
Well, it definitely wasn't wisdom to not tell Elrond and Celebrimbor about Halbrand being Sauron.
Where's Cirdan?
You did what you must, Galadriel. So have I.
It took Galadriel long enough to realise with those elf eyes of hers that Cirdan had sailed off with the rings. And this whole scenario of Cirdan sailing across is nothing more than to add tension that wouldn't exactly exist if Cirdan had looked at the rings. And we'll soon find out why. We then return to not Gandalf and Nori trying to capture whoever's been following them. And their plan is to trip them up using a very easy to see string attached to a stone on either side, because that would definitely work. It's not as if someone would just pull it along with their foot. The second part of their plan is to throw a sheet over them, which once enacted turns out to be Poppy, who just so happens to have found them wandering a fucking desert. And what was the reason for following them as opposed to just shouting after them? Is she mentally deficient? We then cut to them around a fire where Nori asks questions about home, which is weird when you've been together all day, but for some reason waited till nightfall to talk about this.
You came after us.
Wasn't so hard. You haven't exactly gotten very far.
How have they not gotten far? They left you in a green valley, they're now in a desert. That seems pretty far to me. What's happened is we need our Frodo and Sam skinwalkers together, and all we're going to do to make that happen is she just bumps into them in a massive desert.
We appear to be lost.
Well, you won't be for long. Look.
Of course, our characters get lost and then conveniently someone finds them in a desert who just so happens to be able to move the plot along. You could have just written it so they didn't get lost. Why make it worse? Poppy says she was going through Sadoc's old book and found out Harfoots must have came this way a long time ago, concluding this path must have been very important to them. Which I can't understand why, when it's a fucking desert, there's no water, there's nothing to eat, so for what reason would they ever decide to come out here? It makes no sense. But we need them to just have a map that tells them exactly where to go. Whatever happened to...
When in doubt, Eleanor Brandyfoot. Always follow your nose.
We're told the map has a warning that they shouldn't forget the words to the song or they'll just go round in circles. Yes, the Harfoots a long time ago made a song, the walking song, which we've heard before, are actually directions to Rune, rather than just write the directions down. So this, as you would expect, gets them to Rune in about the space of a day. Because luckily Poppy found them in the middle of nowhere and just so happened to bring a map of precisely where to go. We're then shown yet again they're being followed by what looks like a Mad Max costume contest. And that takes us back to Cirdan, who we find just about to dispose of the rings. So because, as he was just about to drop them, his boat was hit by a wave or some kind of sea creature, that makes him decide to take a look at the rings. Even after having previously not had any interest at all in seeing them, now because his boat was rocked a bit, he's now invested in what they are. as opposed to just being rocked and continuing what you were doing like most people would. But then we couldn't have our plot then, could we? So whatever he plans to do, it seems as though destroying them is off the table, and his reasoning is still unknown. We cut back to Sauron, who's woken up by Adar so he can tell him his entire backstory, cause why not, I guess. He tells Sauron he was in his place once a prisoner until he was chosen by Morgoth among 13 people to be blessed and promised power.
I was led up to a dark and nameless peak, chained and left.
It sounds to me like Morgoth was recruiting pledges into his fraternity. Adar says he was left up there until Sauron, Morgoth's servant at the time, showed his face, which he calls beautiful. Sauron tears up when he hears this, missing who he used to be and where he is now. Is this really Sauron? Because it doesn't seem like it. Adar continues, saying he was offered red wine on that nameless pleak and he drank it all, which concludes his story. The relevance being that Sauron is in a similar situation with Adar, or rather he will be. Adar then claims to have freed his people in order to gain the information of Sauron that he has no reason to believe. But Adar releases him anyway because Sauron claims to have the trust of the elves, and he can use that to seek out Sauron so Adar can destroy him. Why Adar is believing any of this when, if you remember, he was told Galadriel had allied herself with Sauron, which Adar should know isn't true because Galadriel wanted to kill Sauron and believed Adar to be in league with Sauron. So there's no reason Adar should agree to this, but he does, and not without having Sauron swear allegiance with his head at Adar's feet.
I vow to serve the Lord of Mordor to the end of my days and his.
So Sauron is released, given a horse to ride off to the elves, with Adar telling the orcs to have him followed. And then just as Sauron promised, he has Waldreg, who's been doing nothing but having the time of his life, killed by leaving the warg unchained. We then see that the elves are preparing to abandon Middle-earth for Valinor as the last leaves begin to fall. And then, as luck would have it, Cirdan arrives.
Perfection does not exist only in Valinor, High King.
No! Butterfingers.
And then Galadriel also gets a ring because reasons. I guess it bounced towards her, luckily, instead of all the other people here that it could have. And Gil-galad doesn't seem to bat an eyelid, which is weird, considering her current track record of fucking up, which at this moment in time, Gil-galad is pissed off with her because of. So I don't really buy that he would just let her have something so powerful without ever having to earn it. But now that the rings have their bearers, the light of Valinor is restored, meaning they no longer have to abandon Middle-earth. This is something Elrond is glad about until he remembers what this could mean for the fate of the elves, and so gives Galadriel a look of disappointment and leaves. Elrond is yet again the only one who sees these rings as a mistake. All the extras in the background don't seem to see how fucking wrong this looks. The way the three of them are enchanted by these rings, unable to take their eyes off it. Almost like they've been corrupted by it. But no, everyone else is oblivious. We then cut away to Celebrimbor, who we find setting up his new forge that was built by the dwarves in Season 1. Which he hopes he'll be able to use, that is, if the rings in fact did work. Which he still doesn't know about because Gil-galad waited an entire day to send a messenger. I wonder why that could be. Well, that's because, as we're about to see, Celebrimbor is told that a messenger has just arrived, someone from the Southlands, who wants to negotiate. That's right, it's fucking Sauron. It's almost like when the writers want someone to be somewhere, they teleport them there, but if it's inconvenient to the plot they want to go on, a long journey is actually as long as it should be.
Well, my lord, do we grant him entry?
And that concludes episode 1. So I guess we'll find out next time if Celebrimbor decided to let Sauron into Eregion, even though he was told not to. Probably. So now that we have all the context of the episode, we can get ourselves a bird's eye view of each storyline. And since we opened with Sauron's backstory, it's probably best to start there. The entire point of this scene is to show us the downfall of Sauron, and they decided to make Sauron retarded for this entire scenario to play out. who rather than manipulate his way into the position he wants like we know that he can, he decides to call his army of orcs ugly little shits who everyone hates, which is true, but maybe instead of outwardly stating that when you should be aware it would go against you, you try to do something a little more intelligent. And all it would take is just don't do that. But he does, and that gets him killed. It's a scenario that doesn't work when you want me to believe Sauron is a highly intelligent manipulator. So I would argue, obviously, we don't need any of this because there is nothing new to be gained from it. We know Adar killed Sauron, we know Sauron's motivations and why he was killed. You don't need to show us every little thing that ever happened, especially if you've already told us. And then to add on top of everything, you decided to show us how Sauron is resurrected, which was the ultimate cringe of the episode. Rather than something a little more mystical and magic, you've made it so, as long as you catch Sauron's blood in a jar, you don't need to worry about him returning. And then because why not, you give us the entire journey of how Sauron came to meet Galadriel, which was already massively contrived, to then make it even worse by showing us how Sauron got there. They didn't even attempt to say Sauron made it happen. They just had it happen. Which then brings us forward to where we left Sauron at the end of Season 1. He decides to go to Mordor for what appears to be gaining Adar's trust, maybe? And his way of doing that is to tell Adar something he wouldn't believe, which somehow works. And that allows him to go to the elves, or in this case, Celebrimbor. Someone who he needs, but could have also been warned of him being Sauron. At this moment in time, he doesn't need Adar, so why not go straight to Eregion? Instead of going to Mordor, getting imprisoned, to then be released to go back to Eregion. Why did you do it in that order? This is something that may get cleared up later in the season, so I'll save my criticisms for when we find out. And that moves us on to Lindon, where Galadriel has been forced to reveal that Halbrand is Sauron. She doesn't just tell them straight away, even though, as was mentioned, her entire motivation was to kill Sauron, who she hunted for hundreds of years. That's how desperate she was. She pleaded with Gil-galad to give her more men to continue hunting Sauron, who she believes to still be alive, even without any proof, which was the reason Gil-galad sent her to Valinor, which she ultimately decided against. So when she does finally have hard evidence Sauron is alive, and she was right all along, she doesn't tell anyone of her own free will. She has to be forced to. When with what we know of her, she should demand an army and anything else she needs to go and find Sauron. But instead they went with an assassination of her character because Amazon forgot the simplest of motivations a character can have. We then have Elrond, who jumps from a waterfall, showing how invested he is in not wanting to use the rings, to then not try and escape with them, but just to wander down the road from where he was. To then take it to Cirdan, who has no mind of his own and just decides to help Elrond anyway. Cirdan isn't interested in the rings or seeing the rings for the silliest reasons of seeing Celebrimbor's work before. And I think we know why that is, because if he did, Amazon wouldn't be able to have their tension. Because Cirdan would see the rings and instantly refuse to destroy them, and we wouldn't have him sailing across the bay. Where the only reason he did look was because a wave bumped his boat, which then made him keep the rings and give them to Gil-galad, which means they no longer have to leave Middle-earth. And finally, we have the Nori and not Gandalf plot, which I really don't have much to say about because not much happens. All of the scenes they had were completely worthless and pretty painful to watch, which isn't that different from Season 1. The Half-Foot plot wasn't integral to anything else going on, they were just there to fulfill the idea that because it's Middle-earth, we need hobbits. I'm sure not Gandalf will tie into the main story later on, but at the moment it's just dragging along without a point. So all we have is not Gandalf had a dream which includes a staff, him and Nori are lost on their way to Rhûn, until they're not lost because Poppy conveniently turns up with directions that the Half-Foots put into a song, and then finally they make it to Rhûn. Out of all the storylines we have, this is the easiest to cut, and we're only going to get more. So yeah, that was a pretty bad start, which, like I mentioned at the start of this video, I am not surprised by. We have all the same kinds of issues that plagued Season 1. But that brings us to the end of Episode 1, and leaving us only 7 more to go. Which now, because Amazon did a free episode premiere, means I've got a lot of catching up to do. But for now, I suppose that's where I'll leave you, so thanks for watching and I will see you on the next one.